Good morning or good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. I just want to welcome everyone. I am Janet Reutman, as you can see on the screen. I'm a founding member of the Platform Economies Research Network and a professor at RMIT University and an associate investigator at the Australian Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making in Society. I want to, because I am in Australia, start by acknowledging that I am on the unceded lands of the people of the Wurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. So I want to say from the outset that the Pern Salon is an annual live streamed event. Because in the honor of Liliana, I'm going to say it's a salon, not a seminar. So it's meant to be a conversation with our guests and amongst ourselves. So it's not a seminar with Q&A. And I just want to invite everyone who's part of the Pern network to turn on your mics and join the conversation. Of course, you can use the raise hand function if you like, but feel free to speak up. For those who are joining online, we're actually going to take you off camera, but please put any comments or questions in the chat. We'll actually be able to see your comments and questions in the chat, and we're happy to share them with Liliana and amongst ourselves. We are all on different continents. We're actually on like 4 different continents, I think, at different time zones. So I really want to thank Liliana Doganova for joining us late in the evening in France. I will briefly introduce Liliana, who has a long list of things to share, but I'll be brief, and then I'll pass the mic to her, and then we can have our open discussion. So Liliana Doganova is an associate professor at the Centre de Sociologie de l'Innovation. In English, that would be the Center of Sociology for Innovation, Sociology of Innovation at Paris Mines, where she's actually also co-director of the program in Public Affairs and Innovation. So her research sits, like many of us, at the intersection of economic sociology and science and technology studies. Liliana is the member of the editorial boards of the Journal Valuation Studies and the Journal of Cultural Economy. She has a host of journal article publications, which I'm not going to take the time to list right now. I do want to note that she's the author of the book Valoriser la science, which was published in 2012, and co-author of Capitalization, a Cultural Guide, which was published in 2017. So today we're going to focus on her most recent book, which is Discounting the Future, the Ascendancy of a Political Technology, which was published last year by Zone Books. I know we all really enjoyed this and saw different ways that the book relates to our own work. I just want to start by saying, Liliana, the book is not a minute too late. One, I thought of all these ways that it pertains to work I've been doing, and happy to talk about that. For the benefit of everyone, Liliana shows how discounting, the practice of discounting, which she will hopefully take a bit of time to explain and we'll talk about. So discounting isn't just a ubiquitous financial practice. We tend to think of it as a financial practice. Her argument is that discounting has become a generalized form or a generalized practice beyond finance, and an essential way of positing value, of positing capital, and even the future. So Lydia, I'm going to pass the mic to you, and 10 minutes for you to say whatever you'd like to say to introduce this and talk about maybe where this has led you. And hopefully we can relate all of this to platforms. So thanks very much. À toi.
Thank you, Janet, and thanks to the Pern network for your invitation to discuss my book. And I would say even more thanks, because the book doesn't really have to do with data nor platforms. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your comments and thinking together about how discounting valuations matter in platform economies, if they do. So I mean, I think that will be like an open question to discuss about in our conversation. I just wanted to warn you. I said this to Jeanette just before we got started, that it's late here in the evening and I have a baby sleeping in the other room and I'm alone for like half an hour. So if ever the baby wakes up and starts crying, I will need to go and take her and then come back. So I warn you, if this disruption happens, I mean, yeah, it shouldn't, but well, just in case you are aware of my my situation here. So I was thinking about what should I say in these 10 minutes, and I thought I should start with like the beginning of the research that led me to being interested in discounting. And this started like now almost 20 years ago, when the economy was getting more and more excited about the new kind of economic actor, the startup, and high-tech startups in particular. And then I was a PhD student researching so-called academic startups, which are startups founded by academics who want to valorize, as they put it, scientific knowledge, and in particular in the fields of ICT, so information and communication technologies, and biotechnology. And so the question that both actors and the scholars studying them were kind of grappling with revolved around the problem of valuation. So the business of startups is to sell the future. And the question that arises then is, how could we value goods that do not yet exist and for which there is no market from which a price can be derived? So if you take biotech startups, for example, this is the kind of startups that I have been focusing on. They sell promises of future drugs to pharmaceutical companies at prices that are often ranging in like millions of dollars. And the question then was, how are these prices determined and agreed upon at a stage when close to nothing is known about the future drugs to which these prices are supposed to kind of refer, if we think of prices as and value as referring to goods with certain characteristics. So what I have been trying to do is to address this how question by looking at the devices that intervene in the valuation of these future goods, what I've been calling like valuation devices. And discounting is one of these devices, one of these valuation devices I've been working on, the one that I have been working on like mostly. Discounting is so a valuation device that is embedded in different formulas that you may have heard of, or maybe you haven't. Formulas that go by names like DCF for discounted cash flow, or NPV for net present value. So these discounting formulas basically state that the value of something is equal to the flows of costs and revenues that this thing is likely to generate in the future. And because these flows occur at different points in time, say year 1, year 2, year 10, year 1000, they are made commensurate by being translated into what we call their present value. So each flow that occurs in the future gets reduced by the so-called discount rate. And you can think of the discount rate a bit as the inverse of the interest rate. So the interest rate translates present value into future value. And in this direction, from the present to the future, value is said to expand. And the discount rate goes in the opposite direction to translate future value into present value. And so when the arrow of time is reversed in this way, from the future to the present, value is supposed to shrink instead of expand. And this is due to this idea that $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow. Or if you put it in different terms, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. So it's the same kind of ideas. So what I have found very interesting in these formulas is the theory of value and the theory of time that are kind of embedded in them. And in particular, the contradiction that they carry. Because on the one hand, discounting formulas value the future as the relevant temporality for guiding action in the present, as the kind of direction that one should look to when thinking about value. And on the other hand, through the mechanism of the discount rate, discounting formulas devalue the future. So exactly the opposite thing. As a time, as a temporality that is less worthy than the present, because it is distant from us and it is uncertain. So it is this like twofold valuation and devaluation, simultaneous valuation and devaluation of the future, that I have tried to make sense of in this book in particular. And it's something that has been causing trouble to people practicing discounting and to people studying discounting. First, because discounting turns to the future, it encounters the problem of uncertainty, the idea that the projections on which it is based are unreliable because we cannot know the future, as people would put it, and even worse, they are manipulable. And second, because of this idea that discounting devalues the future, it is said to discriminate against projects whose effects are long-term, and actions whose effects are more distant in time. So it is this problematic nature of discounting, so both the contradiction that it carries and the kind of controversies or troubles that it has raised among those who practice it. It is so this problematic nature that has led me to try to understand how and why we have come to think of the future and the value in such ways. And probably even most importantly, with what effects, what are the kind of effects that discounting produces in the practices in which it comes to be involved. So the book is an attempt to answer these questions through a historical sociology of discounting as a political technology, as I call it. So basically what the book does is that it applies the analytical apparatus of science and technology studies to, as we say, open the black box of discounting with two rather classical tricks. One is to go back in history in order to denaturalize, so on the one hand, and on the other hand, to focus on moments of controversy in which the script of technical artifacts, to use Madeleine Krisch's term, becomes visible. So what the book does is that it follows discounting in different moments and in different sites. And what it follows, and that's an interesting, it's not always easy to figure out, what it follows is a mathematical formula, so or rather a set of mathematical formulas, because these formulas are changing as they move, as they circulate, but also a way of reasoning and a mode of engaging with the future by means of its valuation or its devaluation. So I argue that this is a particular mode of engaging with the future through the problem of value. And so what emerges from this inquiry is not really a history of the idea or the technology of discounting, but it's rather a kind of collection of situations in which the relationship to the future that is materialized in discounting is being put to the test and transformed and discussed and problematized. So this collection of situations spans over, different sites and moments, as I said. So it starts with the writings of French and German foresters in the 18th and 19th century. It moves to US firms' capital budgeting practices in the second half of the 20th century. The valuation of drug development projects in the global pharmaceutical industry today, and the relationship between the Chilean state and foreign investors involved in the exploitation of its copper resources. So it's a varied landscape, as you can see, what comes out of this inquiry. And I will not say more about these different empirical cases because we'll surely, talk about them in the discussion. What I would like to kind of emphasize in concluding is how discounting has led me to reformulate the questions that I started with. So if you take the first problem, which relates to the valuation of the future. So as I said, the future orientation of discounting is often criticized because of the uncertainty that it induces. Because we look to the future, we face uncertainty, and hence calculation becomes impossible. So actors resort to narratives, imaginaries, fictions, etc. My inquiry has led me to a slightly different question, which is the following. If valuing with discounting entails a turn to the future, who are the actors who claim or who have the capacity to act on the future as a specific temporality? So to put it in other words, how does this turn to the future redistribute agency? Now let's take the second problem, the opposite problem, the problem of the devaluation of the future. So here again, as I mentioned, discounting is often criticized for the short-termism that it induces. And here again, my inquiry has led me to think not so much about longer or shorter futures, but rather to ask whose view of the future discounting carries, whose view of the future discounting kind of enables and prolongs. And what I try to argue in the book is that this view is the view of the figure of the investor, which is a view in which the future is not seen as a continuation of the present, as something that follows almost naturally from the present, but rather as a possibility that needs to be produced and for which requires a sacrifice and hence a reward that goes to the figure of the investor. So it's a slightly different view of what discounting means and entails. And the third set of questions that I came to stems from this ubiquity of discounting. I had the feeling when I was writing this book, and I think this is why it took so long, that the more I was following these formulas, the more I was finding it everywhere and in unexpected places. And so I came to ask myself, can we think of discounting not only as a formula that has gradually become widespread through the action of its promoters, and that has probably performed the world in its own image, if we think about the theories of performativity, but think of it in a different way, rather as a general form of valuation, as you mentioned, Janet, earlier in your presentation. And what I try to suggest, and this is still a hypothesis that I'm working with and trying to make sense of, is that this turn to the future that is inherent in discounting is intimately linked to its capacity to account for the value of all kinds of things. As soon as these different things are disentangled from their past histories and from their present characteristics and kind of thrown into the temporality of the future, thrown into a future that appears as a void temporality, right? This is the idea of uncertainty, as an unknown, as a void domain over which actors struggle to acquire the capacity to act. So these are the kind of questions that I try to formulate in the introduction, but I mean they are that you maybe have read, and these are not the questions I started with, but the questions to which I arrived, and on which I would like to continue thinking, and I hope that discussing with you about that data, the valuation of data and platform economies, can also try to help us shed light on that kind of question. So I stop here and just look forward to your thoughts and your questions.
Thank you so much. Merci bien. That was very clear. And we've read some excerpts. I just want to open it up for people who I saw Seram Avle on here somewhere. Just turn on your mics. I know that Jamie Wong needs to leave to go to a department event. Do you have enough time to go for
I will
it?
try. But thank you so much, Liliana. This book is a revelation. And there are so many moments when I read, I was just celebrating for the pithiness of how you express things. You open with in your introduction, you said, in other words, climate change is at odds with rational decision making. How come? And I read that encapsulates so much about how unintuitive this very pervasive way of thinking about value. So I really enjoyed the book, and I suppose because I just finished reading your conclusion, and I think I find it so fascinating that in the way that I understand it, you're suggesting that discounting may be used to subvert the effects of discounting, and because it's not part of the excerpts that you shared, so I would just say a little bit kind of about what you write verbatim. What if Ugandan families contested the compensations that were offered to them by espousing the dominant future-oriented temporality of valuation that Total Energies had momentarily forsaken? What if they claimed that their land was worth as much as the present value of the future flows of costs and benefits that it was likely to yield if mobilized in oil exploration? And as you say, like, discounting is a very situated and selectively invoked practice. And so as I understand it, you're suggesting if one of the paradoxes of discounting is that its logic is presented as inevitable and natural, and yet it is only selectively invoked, then one way to subvert it is to insist on adhering to it when it is not convenient. And this reminds me of work to rule protests, where workers follow the rules of their contract or jobs to such exacting degrees that operations cannot run normally. And so I'd love to hear more about whether you're, like, in making this move, you're taking inspiration from studying discounting not only as a theory of value, but also a theory of action, and whether or not you see this kind of within this kind of subversion of using discounting against discounting, a risk of further naturalizing it and justifying practices and logics of discounting as self-evident? Or instead, do you see this as a kind of counter-performativity that through adoption of a theory of or model will reduce its verisimilitude? So it's really kind of capacious. It's just because I've just finished reading it. I wonder how you came to that and what you see as how you came to this intervention, and how you imagine if this intervention is taken up, how it will unfold.
Thank you, thank you, Jamie, for your kind words, and also for the very, very interesting question. I think this what I try to express very clumsily in the conclusion, I think, owes a lot to my discussions with Michel Fair and his book, which is called The Age of the Investee, no, Rated Agency, sorry, in English, which suggests this idea that we could, if the logics of investment are kind of inevitable, the investees could try to embrace these logics and turn it against the investors who invest in them. And one of the empirical cases that made me think about this, and on which I'm working on more right now, it has to do with so it's a very specific case, but I think it tells a lot. It has to do with the calculation of the compensation to be paid to investors who sue states for changing their regulations, like, for example, environmental regulation. And there was a recent case that I've started looking at, which is the case of a company called Rockhopper, which was exploring for oil and gas nearby the Italian coast. And Italy changed its regulation forbidding the exploitation of oil and gas nearby, within a certain distance from its coast. And what Rockhopper did was to bring it to the international arbitrage system, in which which is called the ICDS, or the Investor State Dispute Settlement, and to claim a compensation for the fact that its expectations had been betrayed, in a way, right? Saying, when I made this investment, I had made my discounted cash flow calculations, and I knew that my investment was worth that much. Now, by changing our environmental regulation and making it impossible for me to do what I had planned to do, what I had expected to be doing, you are interfering with my valuations, and this is a problem for me, investor. And the interesting thing here is that in investor state dispute settlement, so in that kind of cases, this is not a unique case, there are many of them, DCF, discounted cash flow, is being used more and more often. And I have been looking at what the Italian state replies to that kind of valuation. And what the Italian state does is to say, we can look at the past rather than the future. So look, it has cost you almost nothing to start this exploration. You haven't built anything. There are no workers working there, etc. So if you do a valuation based on the book value of the investment, actually what I owe you is much lower. It's we end up with a very different amount. And I have been thinking about, okay, so what if, so we have a situation in which the investor, the foreign investor, is saying, I have a future, I have an expectation about the future, and this expectation is solid enough, legitimate enough, so that I can receive a compensation for having lost this expectation about the future. I was thinking, how can other actors, like the Italian state, but also there was a massive environmental mobilization against this project. So other actors, how can they make their futures count? How can they develop similar evaluations in which they also do formulate futures, imagine futures, if you wish, and make these futures, how can I say, strong enough so as they need to be taken into account by other actors. So that's a first way of kind of, subverting discounting and its future orientation, saying, okay, investors are not the only actors who make expectations about the future. All kinds of actors make expectations about the future, and their expectations should matter as much. Another way, and that to subvert discounting in this particular case, and that is something that I take from Tony Marzao, who's a legal scholar who's been working on the use of discounted cash flow in investor-state dispute settlement, is to think, okay, let's take this discounted cash flow analysis that the company is doing, but let's work on the discount rate. If you think of the discount rate as an expression of uncertainty, the uncertainty of the future, the more you drill for oil, the more uncertainty you create about the future, because you kind of you how can I say, you act for climate change, etc. So if you want your valuation to be correct, you should use a very high discount rate because of the uncertainty that your project faces and even increases. And if you use a very high discount rate, then the valuation of this investment project gets lower. So it's no longer desirable, even for the investor himself. So that's another way of thinking about how we can subvert discounting calculation in this particular case. So these are the instances that made me think about this idea of like subverting discounting, and what happens if we kind of say, okay, if discounting is a natural way of thinking, let's make it natural. Let's discount all of us, and what could happen then? Now, of course, this thought experiment has its limitations, because calculative capacity, as we know, is not evenly distributed among different actors. So you should think about the conditions of possibility of this thought experiment. But still, I thought that as a thought experiment, it gives idea. It makes us think about different ways of alternative ways of making futures count. Yeah.
Anybody else on that point, or please take off your mics and speak. I'll just jump in then. So just to like roll back a little bit, like I feel like the implications you just discussed, like the implications of looking at discounting, and I think it was really helpful in your introduction to this, the short presentation. I really encourage those who are joining us to read the book, but is the difference between interest rates and the discount rate. Like that for me is something that I really have to sort of take time to think through. And then just part of why we wanted to chat with you, Liliana, is, the question of how what you've presented and what you've researched relates to the production of value on platforms, right? But then there's also this kind of, coming from, as some of us do, not all of us, but more of the sort of anthropology of value and the kind of economic anthropology. So I guess I'm taking an example from your book, so this should be familiar to you. So we can imagine like two distinct statements, just judgments regarding the value of a tree. You use trees so much in your book, so I'm trying to keep with the the example. So one would be there's intrinsic value, right? And you could think of a tree in terms of like good old Marxist, like use value and exchange value. And that would be the intrinsic value of the tree, right? You can cut it down and burn some wood and get warmth. And the other would be the discount value. And that would be the tree in terms of the time value of money, I think. Right? So those are two ways of thinking. There's intrinsic value, but then there's like discount value of the tree. And you might imagine, and I think this is what most people do, and not you don't, but I think most people do, that intrinsic value, like the tree in terms of use value and exchange value, evolves over the course of the 19th and the 20th centuries to become discount value, the tree, right, in terms of the time value of money. And I think I just want to say before I kind of get into my comments that this is maybe for the benefit of everyone, like you illustrate the problem of thinking in terms of this kind of like deterministic historical narrative, that there's one idea of the tree is now evolved to become this new idea of the tree, right? And I think that's really a valuable illustration of like looking at devices of value creation and valuation. So I just wanted to say that this is how I got to my comment. Because so the work I did on like the subprime mortgage crisis, the tanking of that market, in that case, there were academics, so not just people in finance, right? There were academics and people in finance and economics who would say like there's intrinsic value, right? There's an intrinsic value of a house, et cetera, et cetera. And we could say if intrinsic value exists, by discounting all the expected future cash flows back to their present value, you can determine the intrinsic value of an asset. Like, I think there are people in finance who think that that's the case. Like, that's the intrinsic value. You need to do discounting to determine this intrinsic value, right? And so this is sort of your point you're making. Like, discounting is a practice that solves problems. And the problem is the means to establish market price. Or the problem is the means to price risk. I'm less sure about uncertainty. I think it's like they think about it in terms of risk, pricing risk. And I really appreciate your point that this mode of problem solving creates other problems, which I think is what you were just talking about, like allocation of resources, et cetera, et cetera. You raise all this in the book, so I'm not going to review it. But I guess my question, so I'm rambling on here, my comment is this situated practice a way for executives or managers, not only in finance, right, and policymakers, et cetera, in the climate space, as they call it, is it a means for them to establish what they think is intrinsic value? So from an anthropological point of view, being an anthropologist, and this is true for people who come from the kind of social studies of finance world, there is no intrinsic value. That's just a nonsensical thing, right? Value is necessarily like generated in practice, and it's always relative to something else, right? So what you've described is like this act of commensuration between present and future entities, which we won't get into, but it seems like a way to define or create something that could be deemed intrinsic value by relevant actors, what they'll call present value. But and I guess, sorry, I'm rambling on, but I want to make this really clear for you. When Fisher, so it's amazing that you talk about him in the book because I didn't know much of this, but when he says capital is not a particular kind of species of wealth, he's saying there's no intrinsic definition. There's no essential definition of capital. It becomes more dynamic because he relates it to time, and it becomes relative to income, right? And this is exactly what creates the problem of like, well, then what's the price? Like, how do you price capital if it's dynamic relative to time and it relates to income? And I thought that was like an incredible insight of your book. It's really rare that price is taken as like an object of study in the social sciences. So yay, who knew that Michel Foucault wrote about Irving Fisher? But I guess I was curious about the relevance of the anthropology of value. And I'm thinking about like Arjuna Padarai and Jane Geyer and Nancy Munn, probably people who are not part of like the world of, your referential world and the world of things that people you are interacting with. But I think all of those studies are showing how the value of things is transformed, or not just how it's transformed, but how things are constituted as value forms. And it's extremely important because you're not arguing as most people in the social sciences do that discounting distorts the true value of things, or discounting corrupts social values, and so we need to like get back to our true social values, right? Or it generates fictitious value. Like, you can see so much of that in social sciences. So I really want to underscore that you're doing something different. But I was just curious if you had thought about the relevance of, and you can just say no, and then we can move on, really. But I was curious about it because there's such parallel worlds. And others, please like turn off your mics and jump in if that's something that resonates. So yeah.
Thank you, thank you, Janet. I'm trying to think with you.
Sorry, that was
It's
a lot.
interesting because in finance, the value calculated with DCF, with discounting, is called fundamental value. And fundamental value is something that sounds as quite close to this idea of intrinsic value.
Totally.
And there's this, and it comes in often in opposition, and that was the same with the trees I'm talking about in the 18th and 19th century. It is thought of as in opposition to market price, right? Market price being unstable, right? Because prices differ, they can vary in different cases, they vary in time, etc. So they are not seen as a reliable indicator of the value of the thing. For example, the tree. Neither reliable nor true, because there is really this idea about truth. What is the how do we what is the truth of value? This is a very important point in most of the actors in the writings that I'm studying. So there is this idea that there is a fundamental value, as they call it, or economic value, which is different from the market price. And this fundamental value or intrinsic value comes from the what we could call the asset becoming of the tree, of the possibility of the tree, if we take this example, to become an asset, to behave as an asset. And what is interesting is that in this case, when you think of of this idea of intrinsic value calculated with discounting, there is not more stability in the value of the tree, because we have this orientation towards the future. So the value will be very dependent upon the projections about the future that you're making, because there is uncertainty. So the value that you project will not be the value that will actually maybe turn out, I mean, after some years. But I think what is really important is it is the value in a particular moment in time, which defines itself with relation to the future, but which itself does not really have a future. Because when actors calculate these values, these calculations serve decision making. So the idea of, should I invest in this or not? Should I go this way or that way? Should this something be done in this particular moment? So there is this projection of the future, which is completely folded back into the present moment. And once the decision that this valuation is supposed to inform is made, well, it's done. Nobody would go back, further in time, go back to what happened and wonder if this valuation was true or not true. So there is this idea that there is something intrinsic and fundamental in this, as finance people put it, in this calculation, but there is also something very, very ephemeral in it. So it's a kind of it's difficult to think of it, because when we think of intrinsic or fundamental, we think of something that would be stable in time and place, right? Or that would be more true than others. But there is really this idea of I think of in the value in this particular moment. So then it becomes very, I mean, the opposition that you were invoking, like between economic value and market value, or kind of is there another true value that we should be searching for, etc. It does not hold anymore. This is not, there is no difference between between what is supposed to be a true value and something that would be like a speculative value or a price, etc. Because it is all this valuation is very much concentrated in this particular moment of decision making, and this is something that I have been struggling with and trying to understand, and I think it's important to emphasize it. So it's not about a stable value of something in general, it's about the valuation, the true, because there is still this claim, valuation of something in this particular present moment. And then it vanishes. When the decision is made, the whole valuation problem kind of vanishes in what I've been studying. I don't know if this answers your at least partly your question, but that's yeah. Feel free to
Yeah, no, it
continue.
absolutely does. And others, please jump in. But like, would you say that the problem that's being solved then is fundamentals or market price? That's what's very confusing to me.
I mean, it depends on the particular situation. When we talk of, sometimes this valuation is put forward as an answer to the problem of the price of something. So what should be the price of forest land? So this is how this investigation started in scientific forestry. What is the price of forest land? Well, we should calculate the value of forest land in order to determine its price, because price itself is very variable and it's market prices, etc. And it's not true. So in some cases, these valuations are produced in order to ascertain a price.
Like
In
to
other cases,
stabilize it. Yeah.
and to stabilize it, yeah.
Yeah.
In other cases, when you think of valuations made within corporations to decide upon, which project to invest or which direction to go, the price is not a problem. Is not the problem. I mean, there are prices that are involved in the valuation because you kind of project the future prices of drugs, for example. So they are part of the valuation, but they are not the ultimate. The goal of the valuation. So I would say that it all depends on the particular situation. Is there a price problem, or is there an action problem? So what should be done right now? And thinking about the value of things as the right question that one should ask when thinking about what should be done, it's already quite a particular framing, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. Fascinating. Thank you. And please, somebody else, question or comment?
Yeah.
Francesca, please.
Yeah, I would go ahead. So first of all, I read it a second time now, the introduction at least, and I really, again, loved it very much, and it's so rich, and I took loads of notes because it was so inspiring also to my own work. So thanks a lot for that. And then I have a few thoughts, but I would just start with one, which is also about the different kind of situations in which discounting is used. And I wondered also about the role of the past in it, because you say that the past doesn't really matter, but I wonder if in some situations the past actually matters more, or does matter, even though discounting is used. For instance, back in the days, I trained as a financial analyst, so also doing the discounted cash flow analysis. And there, how we did it was, we took the cash flow statement, revenue, some profit measure like EBITDA, and then we took the average growth rate of like the last 10 years, and then extrapolated that into the future and said, okay, so EBITDA this profit measure is going to grow by on average 5% every year, and then it's going to reach this and that amount. And then from there, maybe we take a multiple to get to the kind of the overall value of a company, and then from then use the discount rate. So so this is one situation I know that like discounting is used, and then another situation, for instance, in venture capital, which I also studied now in my own research, it's it's much more future oriented because there's no historical financial figures. You don't look at profit measures, but you look at revenue measures, which is also a different kind of story. So it's also interesting, like what is actually discounted? Is it a profit measure or is it a revenue kind of measure? There I mean, it's more kind of a guess, like, yeah, so in the future, it would be great if the revenue would look like this, and then you discount it. So in that case, I see the point that the past doesn't really matter. But in the case of the kind of established corporate that is being evaluated, or and then you do use kind of past figures, and then you have this kind of interesting meeting of like the discount rate and the growth rate. And then also, I'm also curious about the interest rate in all of that, because sometimes we just used an interest rate for discount rate. So I'm sorry if this is a bit confusing maybe, or I'm confused by it as well, but I still wondered, like, what's the relation, or maybe is there a relation to the past after all, and how do you think about that? And these, like the relationship between these different rates that are used, and it's not only the discount rate.
Yeah, just to jump in, Keen Birch had that same question. He couldn't be with us, but I promised to. He also asked about interest rates. I feel like Liliana is becoming a financial advisor to all of us, but yeah, sorry, go ahead. Jake, did you want to say something or no? Go ahead. Okay.
I haven't been a financial analyst, so I'm sure, Francisca, that I may not. I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can bring anything new to and I have a precise answer to this. What I would say is that to what extent the past matters. Indeed, the past does matter. So when I say that the past doesn't matter, I'm talking about the kind of gesture of discounting, which is, we're going to value now, and what matters is what will happen from this particular moment in time. And so there is no what happened last year, what happened the year before in the structure of the formula, let's say, at least. So there's this idea that we start counting from today. And then, of course, how do you make projections about the future? Of course, you make projections about the future by going back into the past. And this is a point I'm making when I talk about how discounting is used for the valuation of drug development projects, and how actually these future projections become possible. They become possible because this particular industry, but I think this should be the case probably in other industries, has an information infrastructure of databases in which deals about drugs are entered, and you can know that if you're going with this particular drug to target this particular indication, that on average you will have that much sales. On average, your clinical trials will cost that much, etc. So it's what feeds the numbers in the valuation are these averages that are drawn from the past. And you can make the critique, and some actors are making this critique, that actually the futures that these formulas lead us to envisage are actually mere replications of the past. So there is nothing very disruptive in these kinds of futures, because you kind of futures are made out from the past in order to be made calculable, in order to be made agreeable upon, etc. So indeed, the futures in the formula are completely informed by past future. And from my discussions with venture capitalists, I also take this, that it's not so much then the past, because indeed particular startups don't have histories, they don't have a past in a way, but they have comparables. So you can compare this particular startup with another startup, and so it's also a way of filling these futures which are which the formula demands. So I completely agree with you that the past matters as a source of how can I say, of imagining these futures. But what I meant when I said that there is no past is really this gesture of, we do not care about what has happened so far, and how come, for example, this particular startup is here. And that was a very important point when you're studying academic startups, well, as I was, because most of these academic startups were founded by scientists who had been working in a public research organization for a long time with public funding, etc. So the fact that at this particular moment they came up with scientific knowledge that they wanted to valorize, it was not an accident. It was the result of past action, of in particular public support for science. So it's that kind of gesture that I want to emphasize, that this idea of, you know, saying that the past doesn't matter politically is very problematic. So I hope this makes it clear. Now about the different rates, I cannot answer about the discount rate and the growth rate because yeah, I don't know. I should look at this, but I haven't been encountering them together. What I can say about the interest rate and the discount rate is that when you look into the history of discounting of these and the net present value calculations, in the beginning, the discount rate, so the rate at which you discount, is simply the interest rate. When you look at the foresters, for example, in the 19th century, who are writing, they're just taking the interest rate as a discount rate. The idea being that if you need to discount because if you are a forester, say, and at the moment that you decide not to cut a tree that has grown, you forsake a scenario in which you could have cut this tree, sell it on the market, take the money, put the money in the bank, and gain an interest rate. So there is this idea of an alternative scenario. Economists would call this today, I think, the opportunity cost. There is this alternative scenario for which you need to account. In a way, the tree competes as an asset. Once you envisage it as an asset, the tree competes with the bank account, with the bank, and needs to outperform it. So, and the interest rate captures this idea when used as a discount rate. Now, what happens in since the 1950s is a redefinition, at least in the textbooks and in firm practices, from what I have been able to see, a redefinition of the discount rate as no longer the rate of interest, so this idea of a cost of time, but as the cost of capital. The idea being that this time, if we take the same example with the tree, when you decide not to cut the tree, you compare with the scenario in which you sell it and you put money in the bank, but you compare also with a myriad of other scenarios in which you as an investor, you could have put this money elsewhere in all other kinds of assets on the financial market. And this is a very, I mean, the way I say it, I think it's a very important shift in how we think about the discount rate, in the moment in which it's no longer an interest rate, but it becomes the cost of capital, because the rationale is completely different. And this is what I have in mind when I say this idea, you know, of the investor's future. The investor gaze is what informs what you need to take in order to make sense of the very existence of this discount rate. So in the history I'm tracing, there is this clear shift from the interest rate to the cost of capital as a discount rate. So it's no longer the same. It's no longer the same thing. Now, how do today interest rate and discount rates inform each other, combine each other? For example, we could ask, if interest rates go down, does this mean that discount rates would also go down? I'm not sure. I don't have any empirical material on that, so I cannot answer. But I tend to think that this would not necessarily be the case, because if the discount rate is the cost of capital, it really, what matters is this, you know, how financial markets behave, basically, which is of course also related to interest rates, but to me it's a kind of more indirect link. So this is something that I have not been researching clearly, and that I cannot answer precisely.
Fascinating. I have lots to say about that. Jake.
Hi, thank you. This is great. I'm really learning a lot. But I thought maybe we could start directing the discussion to like questions around perhaps how data is valued, which is something of interest to lots of members of the Pern community. And it was really fortuitous when I was reading your chapters, because I've been working on this thing actually with Kian and some others about some of the ways that law participates in configuring the value of personal data. And it was interesting to hear you talk earlier about the way in investor-state arbitration, those arbitrators are participating in determining valuation mechanisms. So we've been looking at a similar thing, which is how remedies cases in data breach and data misuse litigation participate in configuring data value. And jumping back to what Janet was talking about earlier, a big part of this is, on one hand, the economic value of personal data that Kian has written a lot about and others have written about a lot. There's also this kind of risk value, because personal data can reveal things about individuals that they can then litigate on and receive damages awards for. And they can be quite significant damages awards. And it gets even kind of more complicated than that, because if, for instance, there's a hack or a data breach and personal information about an individual is released, the injury that manifests from that breach is a risk that might occur in the future, right? Your private information gets out on the dark web. Potentially there's going to be identity theft. Potentially someone's going to like hack your credit card or mess with your credit or embarrass you or troll you or something like that. So there's like the courts are involved in this really complicated exercise of determining the scope of future risks that are going to be intelligible to their task, which is to put a financial quantum on that risk as a remedy to the individual for having lost control over their data. So I'm reading your like wonderful work about how the future participates in like strategic financial valuation strategies, and then I'm looking at the judges kind of hack their way through like, like, oh, what's a real injury? What's not a real injury? What kinds of things do we think are reasonable to pay for? Like identity monitoring and is reasonable, but like we can't compensate you for a future for an impending risk that hasn't necessarily manifested yet. And I'm just, it's one of the things that's very interesting to me looking at all this stuff is how the economic assumptions get sort of pushed through the legal shapes that they have to in a litigation process and then come out the other end completely disassembled, right? It's a very awkward encounter. Like legal doctrine and laws that participate in shaping commodities, when you get to the pointy end, which is like damages, like turning these rights back into money, there's something doesn't quite work. So, I'd love to hear perhaps, like, I don't imagine you've thought about this explicitly, but I wonder if perhaps from your other empirical examples, there are cases of kinds of assets where like the risk profile is really complicated, really uncertain, and how discounting participates in the valuation practices associated with those particular assets. And I hope that was clear. Sorry.
Can I just ask Seiram, is what you have to say related to this?
It could be. I don't know. It has something to do with whether or not discounting. Like I had questions about what futures. I think when Jake was talking about judges having trouble assessing sort of injuries, the thought that popped into my head was about, it's like a range of possibilities. So a probable future has a number of scenarios and possibilities where something could happen, right? So when you're discounting of, some future, is it a probable future? Is it a possible future, which has like the widest range of possibilities, right? So there's some kind of like, I'm trying to figure out the bounds of what future gets discounted within the things that Liliana kind of looked at, right? And so it's both like a technical question in terms of like, do these formula account for that, these different kinds of futures, and it's also just more like, let's think about, you know, temporalities and like the way futurists think about futures. Like, it's not a fixed point, so you can pick 10 years or 100 years, and I can come and argue with you about whether my 100 years is likely to produce more injury over your 10 years in a court case. But like, which future are we arguing about here? So there's like that's kind of where my head went when Jake was talking. So that's why my hand went up.
Yes, similarly, I wasn't going to actually say this, but I guess I will since the opening happened, is that I was also thinking about that distinction, which is made in finance through Frank Knight. There's this thing called Knightian uncertainty, between uncertainty on the one hand and risk on the other. So Michael Power, for those who don't know, he's in the UK and works in like social studies of accounting. Wrote something called Organized Uncertainty, Designing a World of Risk Management. And that distinction really matters in pricing risk. But I think that Liliana's answer to my first question is like, this isn't necessarily only about pricing risk. So yeah, that question of what sorts of futures, I had the same question, but more in terms of like, is this about like Knightian uncertainty, or is it more about like, how does that distinction between uncertainty and risk play out here? And I think it's very muddy as we're all sort of gesturing towards. But Liliana, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Yeah, if you have any, that's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot, and yeah, I'm wondering how to take it. Let me start by saying how this idea of risks come in the pharmaceutical industry, the way that these valuations are done in the pharmaceutical industry, because I think it's a very specific case, and also it would resonate. So the pharmaceutical industry is often claiming that there is a lot of uncertainty there, right? Because when you do drug discovery, this is research, this is science, what they're doing. So there is a lot of uncertainty in science, etc. And first point, one of the arguments I'm trying to make in the book is that you should look at this uncertainty first as a discourse that is strategically mobilized by actors in order to claim rewards. So in the pharmaceutical industry, usually when you talk about the overall uncertainty in the industry, this often goes together with the idea that this is why we need high prices for our drugs. So first, look at uncertainty not as something that is kind of inherent characteristic of the future, right? The future is uncertain because we do not know it. This is often how we think about the future. I mean, it's also how sociologists often talk about the future. The future is something uncertain. So rather look at this uncertainty not as a characteristic of the future, but as something that is actively produced by actors, first in their discourses, but also through their calculations. And in one of the chapters of the book, I take precisely Frank Knight and his distinction between uncertainty and risk, because it's so common in economics, but also in sociology. And I think this is really, sociologists often kind of readily take this distinction from economics without often questioning it. And going back to his work, I try to demonstrate that in his thinking, this distinction between uncertainty and risk is not an epistemological problem. It's not a problem about knowing in which ways uncertainty is different from risk. It starts with a problem of the distribution of wealth among different kinds of actors. This idea of how can we explain that entrepreneurs have such high revenues? This is the problem that he starts with, and he says, oh, it's because they accept to take care of this thing that we call uncertainty, and that cannot be taken care by other industries that deal with risk, like insurance, for example. And because the entrepreneurs, they they sacrifice in a way themselves. I'm using this image of the sacrifice. They sacrifice themselves for society by accepting to take care of uncertainty. This is why they require high reward. So even in Frank Knight, his problem is not one of, this making a neat distinction between states in which there is uncertainty and states in which there is risk. His problem is how can we account for the high revenues of entrepreneurs? And I think this is a problem that is still very, very relevant today. So first point here is the whole distinction between uncertainty and risk. I think it should be kind of we should open it up, right, and not just take it as such. So that being said, how do if you take the evaluation of drug development projects, how does uncertainty on risk is embedded in these calculations? There are two ways in which they do this, and they're very different from what Jake you were referring to. One thing is to integrate probabilities into the valuation, saying that each cash flow has a certain probability to occur. And this is only possible, as we're discussing earlier with following Francisco's comment, it's only possible because you can have probabilities, because you have databases with past clinical trials that tell you that on average in this indication for this particular clinical stage, we have that much probability of your drug moving from one stage to the other. So one way to integrate risk is to translate it into probabilities and to attach these probabilities to each cash flow. Another way, and this is why actors themselves are making this distinction between uncertainty and risk, is to integrate the idea of uncertainty into the discount rate and basically say, because uncertainty in this industry is very high, we need to have higher discount rates. And this is a very different way of dealing with uncertainty, because then you don't need to specify the risks and to kind of attach them to particular events or to particular courses of action or to particular scenarios that might happen. But it's this overall discourse about uncertainty being integrated into higher discount rates, meaning also higher rewards required by people who invest in this industry. And these two ways of kind of putting risk and uncertainty into the valuation formula, they are quite different. And then there is a third point, and it relates to, I think, what Seiram was also saying. Once what companies do, I mean, at least this is what the managers I've been interviewing tell me, is that they do not produce a single value. So we have, say, one drug development project, and then you try to value it. What you produce is not a single value, but usually would produce different scenarios. Okay, if this happens or that happens, so we have very high sales, or there is something that goes wrongly in the clinical trials, etc. So they would do what they call sensitivity analysis. So they would produce these different valuations that correspond to different scenarios, and you have many different values coming out of this valuation, many different possible values for this particular project, for example. And it's interesting because here uncertainty is also produced by the calculations themselves, right? Because you have this kind of range of different valuations that become possible, and also different scenarios that become tangible in a way. So this is yet another way of thinking about risk and uncertainty, and how it can be, how it intervenes in that kind of valuation. So here it's more the result of multiplying the valuations to produce this kind of multiple values. And this also relates to, it's a different example. I'm just trying to think with what you were suggesting. This also relates to scenario analysis, which is becoming more and more organizations, I think, are using today. And I've been talking with people from so that's a very different it's a very different setting, from the NGFS, which is the Network for Greening Financial. I forgot. So it's a network of central banks concerned with sustainability and how you can achieve this. And what they have been telling me is that they no longer do cost-benefit analysis or discounting calculations, because you have this problem of the discount rate. And they would rather use different tools for thinking about the future, which are these scenario analysis, in which you can map and kind of draw different kinds of futures without trying to point them down to a single value, which allows them to escape from the problem of the discount rate. So this is another way of, in a way, reducing uncertainty or multiplying futures and making these future coexist rather than translating them back into value. So I do not know to what extent this follows on answers what you were saying, but I think all these are different ways of thinking how risks and uncertainties are part of the valuations produced by the valuations, or even trigger the valuations themselves.
Yeah, no, that is very helpful. Thank you. And as I'm thinking through the drug example, the pharmaceutical example, it strikes me that pharmaceuticals are probably, like, you can imagine pharmaceuticals as like data if they were subject to like an extremely lax regulatory regime that meant that they constantly caused injuries that were compensated at relatively low levels. And then like how that's the kind of world of risk and uncertainty that we're talking about, and it strikes me that especially that third mechanism that you described is really probably what's happening in big companies with big data holdings. So yeah, thanks very much.
Yes.
And just to follow up on this, indeed, regulation is actually very, very important, because all these valuations are made possible partly, at least in the pharmaceutical industry, because there is a very clear image of the future, which comes from regulation, right? Because there is this image of the pipeline through which a drug needs to go in order to reach the market. So we need to do these different clinical trials, and then you go to market after 10 years, and then this happens and that happens. So there's this image of the pipeline, which is actually an image of a linear future, which completely structures the valuations that are made in this particular industry. And it's interesting because in a way it's the fact that there is such regulation, such strong regulation, that enables these future-oriented valuations, or at least makes them easier and possible, because time is, which I think would not be the case in the data and platform industries that you're studying, where time and the future, I suppose, is much less linear and less structured by regulatory frameworks, for example.
Yes, super interesting point, that last one about the difference. Yeah, and Angela, go for it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Liliana. I like echo everyone. Your book is written in such a clear and lucid way, and I learned so much. I think my question, take a step back, and I've been thinking how to ask this in a way that makes sense. So I'm asking from the point of view of socialist accounting, which I've been studying, looking into for a while. And I really want to hear what you think, because you've been thinking so much conceptually about the relationship between temporality and the theory of value or valuation. And in socialist accounting, I think what's interesting is really a lot of the valuation based on the past, like the book value. And also, like, although they claim that they price things in a way that reflect intrinsic value, and we all know, like, it's really their construction of it, and it's not coherent at all. And when socialist accounting in China, after economic reform, one thing they were struggling with is to introduce discounted cash flows, because that entire way of thinking of valuation is really alien to this universe. And I asked this because I thought it was very interesting. In the beginning opening remarks, you mentioned that one key question you ended up kind of raising after this research is to see, or to ask, whose view of the future like this kind of valuation carries. And you say what's very interesting here is the investor's view of the future, and then although it's a possibility, is presented as something that needs to be produced at the sacrifice of whatever. And that seems to reflect a lot of how socialist planning think about future. Like, for them, there is this future that needs to be happen, and we can sacrifice anything in order for that to happen. And then I was just thinking the way of valuation of how central planning works. So what's the connection between that and this very similar way of thinking about future and how to make choice in the present. And like related to this, somewhere you also mentioned like quantification is a kind of commensuration between different objects or different things. And then discounting here, as you unpacks really nicely, is the commensuration across temporalities. And when I think about central planning, it's really sort of translated into kind of commensuration between sectors, in a sense as the central planner's gaze is ultimately about choosing a sector and kind of deciding where to let the value flow. And in a way, it's a little bit like the industrial policy nowadays that China like did a lot and the US is trying to mimic. So that kind of decision making at that level is also highly future oriented, but it's kind of seems like a sectoral kind of relations. I don't know. It's just like all of this, my thoughts just point in different directions. I just wonder what's your thoughts on that, given like you've done so much thinking on temporality and the theory of value. Does it make sense? I don't know.
Yeah, thank you, Angela. Yeah, it does make, of course, it does make sense. It's interesting what you were saying, because I've been discussing with a colleague whom work you surely know, Horacio Ortiz, who's been writing a lot on valuation and finance more broadly, and he's based in China right now, and he was telling me also about this idea that the fact that China was kind of resisting discounted cash flow valuations when and it was interesting to see how, even though I've been arguing that discounting is ubiquitous, they are kind of, it's not, there are some, it's not, I mean, how can I say, it's not in all spaces that you can find that kind of valuations, and they have been kind of refused, from what he told me, from valuations in China. I don't know if this is still the case, but it had been for at some moment, or at least there was this debate. What is interesting, I don't know anything about central planning and socialist planning in China, but what is interesting is that in France they used to be planning too, and planners were using the discounting and the discount rate, and there's a very nice paper by Peter Miller, who's also a scholar in the social studies of accounting, where he talks about the introduction of discounted cash flow in the UK in the 1980s, and his argument is that discounted cash flow analysis was promoted by the state as a way of acting at a distance on firms' decision-making practices, on their investment practices, through the determination of a discount rate, and also through the how can I say, through the imposition of a valuation device that firms should use if they want to if they wanted to engage with the state. So in France, so the discounting was used by commissariat au plan, so the planning commissariat. I don't know how to translate it in English. How would you say this, Janet? The commission, Marie, the commission on planning. And it's interesting if you start looking at how the definition of the discount rate has changed through the different plans, and in the one of the last plans, I think, yeah, it was the last one before this the planning commission was ceased to exist. The discount rate was reduced quite heavily, with the argument that it should reflect the price that which, as a society, we are ready to pay for future generations. So it's no longer the cost of capital, the social discount rate as it is used today in cost benefit analysis, but it's a very different view of the future, like more of a, how can I say, a government view of the future, like a future, the future as embodied in future generations. So the discount rate as a relationship between present and future generations, which is very different from what we have been talking about so far. And there is this very nice expression talking also about the interest rate that in this last plan, where they define the discount rate as a taux d'intérêt général, which means a general interest rate. So it's interest rate, which is a play of word on general interest rate, or so interest rate that is generalized to to government or to society, but is also a rate of the general interest, a rate of the public interest. You can also see it like this. So you can see that planning, government planning, or central, let's say government planning, does not have to, I mean, it can make use also of that kind of discounting calculations. So when I say that it carries the investor's view of the future, I think it hinges really upon this definition of the discount rate. So the ways in which we define the discount rate as a relationship between the present and the future, or as that the price that needs to be paid to the kind of actors who accept to take care of the future. These two different definitions of the discount rate are what produces different views of the future. So the investor's view of the future, or other views of the future. So once again, I don't know if this answers your question, but I thought. Yeah, what is really how can I say, the crux of the matter here is really this definition of the discount rate as a relationship between different temporalities, and as different definitions of what this future actually is.
Yeah, on that, so I know Liliana was keen to kind of have a conversation also about data and platforms. I think we're all trying to learn so much about the generalization of the discount rate. So it's been incredibly informative. Does anybody, I have something, actually, since it flows from what you were just saying, maybe I'll just go for it. Thank you, Angela. It's because of this question about the universalization or the generalization. And so I was asked to write something actually about the role of the international consultancy firms, like the management firms like Deloitte and KPMG and blah, blah, blah. And much to my surprise, I found that they have a big role, which I'm not going to talk about right now, but in relation to remittances and remittance flows, so transfers to sub-Saharan Africa by migrant workers, for example, or academics or whoever is living outside of Africa, those transfers to sub-Saharan Africa, and they become an asset class. And I never thought about like the discount rate at all, haven't written about it at all, but you got me thinking about it. And the reason why they've become they have been able to be posited as an asset class is because they're digitized. So if there weren't platforms and they were just like transfers being made through banking systems, but also informally, through various means, I don't think I know this would not happen. So the digitization of these remittance transfers, right, international transfers, right, to sub-Saharan Africa, led to the emergence of remittances as this kind of new asset class. It is a relatively new thing, right? And so the remittances are not just seen as like an international transfer, as we always thought of them, but they're seen as a future flow, like a future revenue stream. And that, as I said, that can only happen because now because there are digital traces, they can be accounted for on central bank balance sheets. Whereas before it would have been like someone traveled and brought the money, or, it happened in all sorts of ways that weren't necessarily accounted for. And they can be accounted for as part of foreign exchange reserves. But this is done specifically for financial securitization. So they create these asset-backed securities. And the securities, which are like debt instruments, right, are traded on secondary markets. And the asset-backed, like it used to be homes in the subprime mortgage market, right? As you know from Martha Poon's work, the asset here are the remittance flows. And that's the goal, right? That's the end game here. And so the discount rate, thanks to you, discovered, I looked into it yesterday, in remittance securitization is the rate at which the expected future cash flow from the remittances are discounted to determine their present value. And that's crucial for pricing the securities. Like that's the end game, is to price the securities. So it's really important to think about this, for me anyways, what is priced are the securities, not the remittances or the flows themselves, right? It's the securities. And so this is an example of like the financialization of migrant income, migrant, eventually wealth, we hope, right? So it's been financialized, and it really underscores your point about like discounting as becoming a more generalized practice, right? But so we could note the role of the international consultancy firms. I think this sort of relates to how governments are now, different public agencies are now using discounting in various ways. And I'm wondering though about this overwhelming role of the secondary markets. Like is discounting a practice in carbon markets so that you can trade carbon, and the secondary markets are really where the value propositions are, to use financial terms. That's really my only thought. Yeah. And others should jump in if they have thoughts about this, because I feel like Liliana's being put on the spot to talk about things she hasn't studied. So, yeah. Anybody else?
But I can react. I'm not sure if this is relevant at all, because as you say, I haven't studied this, but just two quick reactions. Now the first one is it's interesting it's this idea of flows, because it's for something to be valued with these techniques, you need to ensure that there is a flow in the future, right? If you want to transform, when I was saying earlier, if you want to to throw things into the future and transform them into in part of the game is how can you create these flows, and how can you make these flows sustained. And in some of the papers, I don't remember which one it was, that I read about data valuation, like reading a little bit for this discussion today, there was this interesting observation that companies need platforms need to ensure that they will be producing data continuously, so that there is this kind of flow in the data that does not cease, in a way, right? So I was thinking about this, about the work of transforming things into flows, because a flow is a very peculiar thing. You need to have traces, as you were saying. So when it's digitalized, you need to be able to locate these things. So part of the flow is to be able to to outline it, right, and to put it in a particular direction. So and to make sure it's sustained. And I think this is I mean, when you go back to the trees that I've been studying, it's very interesting to see how discounting valuations are born at the same time, more or less the same time, or in the same space as the notion of sustainability. So the sustainable forest, a forest in which there are always trees that are growing, right? So we need to ensure that the right rotations and the right plantation, so there is always this kind of sustained yield. That's how the foresters call it. So there is something about this, ensuring that there is a kind of future, a kind of space in which a flow can occur. And I think this example about the remittances, I'm not really sure I exactly understand what the remittances are, but I'm very interested in this, in this, for these valuations to occur, you need to be able to create the flows. And this is part of the business models of companies, right? Which are, geared towards the production of flows rather than discrete, how can I say, exchanges that would happen at a certain point in time. So this kind of continuous future is, I think, very important in the production of that kind of, in the production of the world in which these valuations can unfold in a way. And the second, yeah.
I was going to say, exactly. And part of the thing is that it is true that platforms do facilitate that. And secondly, the reason why remittances are considered like a quality asset relative to others, I guess I'm saying that wrongly, but is the diversity So some are coming from the Gulf, you know, migrants working in the Gulf. Some are coming from Nigerians who live in London who are very high income earners. Some are coming. So if there's a war somewhere, the remittance flows won't all stop. So that's considered right. And so to your point, I do think that platforms really facilitate. I mean, Martha Poon is not with us on this call, but like she really has in the past done some sort of preliminary work that she hasn't really published though on the fact that the secondary markets are so crucial to the valuations of these big tech platforms. Not so much as we know. I mean, some of them are money losing, so you know, revenue or profit is a problem. Whereas the secondary markets are really where they generate a mass amount of value because of these kind of diverse and very sustained flows, or what can be characterized as asset classes that have future flows. Yeah, I think actually platforms are a rife area for studying this. Yeah. Anybody else? Or in the can look in the chat on
yeah, I think my comment or question is probably around the way you're working with performativity in the book, in relation to this question of platforms. So, because I study decentralized technologies, including decentralized finance platforms, and what we kind of have there is the token as this object which can be treated in different ways and designed to do different things. So the value is kind of constructed through those design processes, and of course through the kind of more regulatory constraints that might be put around them over time, etc., which we're seeing play out now, making them conform into, say, existing financial regulation, etc. But what's been really, really interesting over the last, I suppose, 5 or 10 years in this area is that once you open that up, that ability to do that kind of flow as you're talking about of these digital objects and how they move and the way that they're used to produce value, you get all kinds of crazy things. And like prediction markets, I think, would be something really valuable for someone like you to look into, which are literally about, let's kind of create not just kind of betting markets, but the ways in which they actually do influence future events is super interesting too, because financial markets start looking at these prediction markets, which are decentralized with many, many actors involved, not just, your kind of typical financial players, but kind of just general token holders kind of getting in on it, etc. So what I'm kind of getting at here is I think the actors change in who is involved in the construction of these kinds of devices that you're talking about. And often there's a kind of performativity we see in things like DeFi, where they just bring in things like discounting or whatever. I'm not saying that one in particular, but they're just bringing in the same mechanisms, but using decentralized technologies at the back end. But that still does change how these things roll out, I suppose, through other systems, and our ability or not to constrain or control them changes as well. So yeah, really what I'm getting at here is what I find really interesting in the work that you've done as well is just how quickly discounting happened. Like the way that, it's a pretty recent history that suddenly kind of railroads finance. There might be very early versions of it, but the kind of Fisher stuff you're talking about and how it kind of plays out after that is quite fast from my reading of it. So, and so kind of going back to that question when we started at the beginning, where there's this kind of, well, actually, if that can happen so fast, the next thing can happen really fast as well. And some of the things I've been keeping an eye on are eco capital and the eco credits and different ways of thinking about land regeneration, etc., through these digital tokenized platforms and the way that might shift. So I suppose my comment or point is really that we tend to take all these things which feel so deterministic in the world right now around how finance creates certain outcomes. they can also change really, really quickly, and maybe in positive ways. So I kind of like that provocation that maybe there is something we can usefully do with this stuff. So I just wanted to kind of make that comment on question. And so the performativity to me, I think you deal with it quite well in the book. Like it's not a determinism. Like it can actually, things can change or shift. So yeah, maybe, I mean, but for me, it's also about how do we factor all this into it when we're trying to study these things? How do we kind of take the performativity that's occurring, but not in a way that's taking it as a given, or taking that these things will necessarily continue to play out that way, particularly now as finance itself with platforms is becoming so unbundled in a way. Like it's the players are shifting, the mechanisms are shifting, the flow, as you call it, of data and oracles, etc., and who builds and controls them is shifting so quickly. So yeah, I mean, my question is more around that. Like, how do we not just accept the inevitability of all this stuff?
Cheers, great question. Liliana, I know you probably have a lot to say. Just because the comment in the chat from Phoebe directly relates to that possible alternative futures, I'm just going to read really quickly. This is from Phoebe, who's online here. Liliana is saying that valuation and discounting is on the valorization of particular moments in time, and presumes that there is going to be no change in the future. For example, the discount rate as the cost of capital. So how can these institutions and infrastructures that are heavily extractive and exclusionary be reconfigured or reviewed to incorporate more uncertainty about the future? It was sort of the point that Liliana was making earlier. In short, how can we get these institutions to relate to what Ellie just said? How can we get these institutions to reorganize their financial assessments on the basis of likely scientific climate change in the future? So yeah, it's like thinking about resources in a different, in terms of different valuations, I guess would be the best way to put it. But Ellie put it better than me. So yeah. So I know that's all like a lot, Liliana. So just feel free to say whatever you'd like as some final comments. I think Ellie brought the thread nicely back to the platforms.
Yeah, thank you. A lot to say, and I'll just try to to say something briefly about on the second part, the second questions about change. It's interesting because when you look at moments in which alternative valuation methods have been like kind of proposed and discounting has been criticized, and there are a lot of these. I mean, its history is recent, but there have been a lot of moments in which it has kind of, attracted debates and criticism. I have been struck at how actually it has remained in spite of these harsh attacks. And at some moment there was the proposition to use something called real options valuation, which comes from finance, with the idea that discounting does not account for the uncertainty of the future. I mean, when you make the valuation once, you assume that the future is already traced and that you will not adapt to the new information that will be generated as action will proceed, right? So there is this kind of deterministic feature in discounting, and people were proposing to use something different, because real options valuation. So think of the future as not a line on which you decide now and which unfolds once you have decided upon it, but as a series of decisions that are made, and according to which you adapt your the course of action. So incorporating financial options valuation with the famous Black-Scholes formula, for example, into corporate decision making. And the interesting thing is that even though it sounded like it made sense in a way, right? It was a failure. And one of the reasons that was put forward is that you would need to change all the decision-making processes within companies in order to make this valuation method possible. So, for example, if you want to do like financial markets do, so that options can apply, you will need to make decisions very often So you will need to make a lot of meetings all the time to value things. So we need to create this kind of continuous valuation, which in the context of the organization it would not be possible. And then there was the problem of data, the data on which, and this is going back to the point raised by Francesca about the past, you need data in order to make these formulas work. And these data has been gathered and kept within organizations with this valuation method in mind. So it's very difficult to debunk one valuation method because it goes with a whole infrastructure around it. And I'm not talking much about this in the book, but it's a very important point. So it's not so easy to change in a way. And when you think of discounting in policymaking, there have been very strong controversies over the use of discounting in climate change policy. And in notice about the definition of the discount rate with some economists proposing that we should use a discount rate close to zero in order to be equitable with future generations. And these propositions have not been, I mean, first they have raised very fierce controversy, but still all this discussion has been structured within the frame of valuation through discounting, right? So changing the discount rate, but still keeping this idea that in order to decide about what should be done, you need to calculate the value of these different courses of action. And this is one way of calculating this. So these are kind of, big moments of controversy and big moments of discontent with discounting, which have not challenged its predominance. So I'm not sure how quickly it can change. And at the same time, given what's going on in the last year, I have started to move from a kind of critique, let's say, of discounting valuations into, well, maybe it's not so bad to base our decision on that kind of valuations and calculations rather than, deciding about, for example, halting climate policy based on completely different, rationales. So at the same time, there is a potential for change, as we can see, but not necessarily in a good direction. So this is on the point about change, and on the point about outside markets that Kriti was making. One case that I have been very interested in that I did not include in the book because I didn't have the time to is it still has to do with economics, but less directly. There is this idea that certain individuals, certain kinds of actors have different ways of discounting in their individual decision making and in their individual behavior. So it's the hypothesis of economists that individual act by making that kind of discounting calculations in their head when they decide when they should do. And the idea that the poorer people are, the higher discount rates they have, because they're too much entrenched in their present and not enough thinking about their future. And I would like to this is one of the research that I would like to pursue to see how these how claims about the possibility of different kinds of actors to think about the future or to claim a future are being made, and how the possibility of how can I say, how the capacity of actors to make futures is also related to their to the material means, to the material conditions of their living, with this critique of the poor individual that I've been seeing also in environmental policy as the poor as incapable of thinking about the future, and for example also thinking about the environment, etc. So this critique of the incapacity of certain actors to care for the future and what this means, which also goes with a kind of with a critique of a focus on the present. And yeah, this is something that I would really like to pursue my research on, thinking about the capacities of different actors given, claimed, or formed to embrace different temporalities in their relationships.
Yes, on that note, just and we should end soon. I know some people had to drop off. Specifically on that note, only because I started with my comment about the economic anthropologist. Sorry, I can't resist. Is Jane Geyer, who recently passed away. has written specifically on that, and I have too, but using her work, and it's this inability, this yeah, I will say inability of the economists and especially development economists who went through Africa and totally missed acts that were actually acts of savings. So in the economic anthropology literature, it's called thesaurization, which is a terrible word, especially in French. But it is really interesting because all those practices were not accounted for as acts of saving and creating stores of wealth and value, which are obviously completely oriented to the future, especially in the context that evidently that you're referring to, where evidently poor people don't, are incapable of thinking about anything but their present security, Yeah. Yeah. So there is stuff on that related specifically though to just livelihoods, really, not the environment, unfortunately. Yeah. Any last comments from anyone? I know we've gone over time, way over time, and Lotta.
Yes, thank you so much. I made me think about a lot of things, and most of all, this thing of the temporalities, which was my first interest when I started studying anthropology. And on that note, I went to a seminar last week about a couple of philosophers here in Stockholm were thinking about how to make sense of the crazy world we live in right now. And one of them, who is always a real provocateur, he talked about, and this is again, Sweden, quite affluent society, not a lot of poor people and so on. But he said, don't think so much about the economy, think about the chrononomy, because time is much more valuable in the future than what we used to think about it. So I just want to give that to you to think about with your future project. I kept my mind a lot about the chrononomy of whatever.
There you go. That's a good closing general statement for us and for Liliana to take home. Liliana, I'm very conscious of the fact that it's almost midnight for you. Il est minuit, non? Yeah. So yeah, yes, we should really let you go to get rest. Really thank you. Discounting as evaluation device was like and a great illustration of performativity, as Ellie said. I think that was definitely real highlight of learning more about your work. Stay in touch with Pern. We're happy to continue conversation and thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for giving us the opportunity. So merci bien, and get
Thank you.
rest.
Thank you for the invitation and for the conversation. That was great.
Yes, of course. Lots of stuff and to be continued and lots of clapping. So there you go. And then for everyone else, we are now annual Pern Salon will probably be in the next North American fall, Southern Hemisphere spring, I think. But word will go out about that, and see everyone online or in person sometime very soon. So have a good day or a good evening wherever you are.